everybody. Good morning and welcome to this year's last episode of History Matters, and so does coffee. Indeed, mega coffee. Normally I pre-record this because normally I'm on the road, and this year I am not on the road. So someone yesterday on some form of social media was like, live? Like, I'm here, which is actually kind of nice because I like seeing out the year with you folks. So that's what we're going to do. And in fact, the topic that we're going to talk about today is what happens next, or what comes next. What happens next is going to be thinking about history, thinking about the past year, thinking about what's coming down the road. But before I move on to that, I will turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted to be live as well. And I'm also usually on the road running around. I have 6 nieces coming tonight for a sleepover. So
wow.
As we wrap up, I will be wrapping things up for them. So we're excited to be together today live. This is a special holiday treat. And we encourage everybody to engage in the chat. We already have a very robust chat going on. There's a very interesting bingo card that was made specially for today.
Bingo card.
Bingo card, yes. Very, very fun bingo card. So maybe somebody could put that on Facebook for the friends that join us through Facebook. But the most important thing we do want to do is ask great questions. And the way that happens is you have to put them in the Q&A because the chat goes way too fast for us to monitor. So once we get rolling with the discussion, please add lots of great questions in the Q&A. And in about 30 minutes, Joanne will address them. Have a great show, folks.
Okay. And I will mention what I mentioned at the beginning, which some folks might have missed, which is the History Matters community is an amazing community. If you are joining us for the first time ever or live for the first time, please go into chat. Make sure you click whatever the language there is, all participants, and tell folks that you're new. This is the first time you're here live because they will welcome you heartily into the community. It's an amazing community. Okay, so indeed, and Newbie's very active, so I'm glad he's piping in too. So today I do want to talk about what comes next. I do want to talk about thinking about a year ahead as we close a year. As a historian, obviously, I want to use not just the past year, but history to help us think this through and to guide us into framing things and centering ourselves, I guess, to sound kind of new agey as we move into a new year. Now, I'm going to say this word. For those of you who don't know, people play bingo, have been playing bingo with History Matters for quite some time. And it's always funny for me because I now know certain words that when I say them, someone will get bingo. So these folks have trained me now to know. But the word that I say most often and that I talk about all the time when I'm talking about history, apparently, as I have been told, you need to look at today's bingo card. I suspect, I have not seen it, I suspect that the entire bingo card will be this one word, and that is contingency. I have now said the word. 2 words, contingent and contingency. Okay. At any rate, the reason I say that all the time, I see on the bottom of the screen, bingo, bingo. Love you guys. The reason I say that all the time is because in truth, seriously, you can't understand history generally without acknowledging the fact, thinking about the fact, and thinking about the weight of contingency in the past, the fact that people are living their lives forward and not able to look back on what's happening to have a very clear sense of what's going on. They're walking into the unknown in one way or another. To understand the past, we have to bear that in mind. The last book I did that was about was The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War, was about the lead up to the Civil War and the mental game that I had to play with myself for the 17 years I wrote that book was pretending that I didn't know the Civil War was coming so that I could kind of understand what my people in the book, how they envisioned their world. I'm actually going to come back to that a little bit later in my comments this morning, but contingency to understand history in some ways, you have to factor in contingency. Now, that said, the reason I chose this topic today is actually, I think, it might be the topic I used on the very first episode of History Matters. I think it was. Look at that. I kind of love that. Obviously, one of the reasons I'm bringing it up is we have been living in a time of extreme contingency for years. Now, this last year has been somewhat less feeling like extreme contingency. There's still pretty extreme contingency. I'm going to come back to this again at the end of my comments this morning. But, you know, we've been living in times when, for very good reason, to differing degrees at different times, we've been worried about democracy, the fate of democracy, the health of democracy. I think we should still be thinking about that. But again, we'll come back to that. But we've been thinking about the serious erosion of democracy. We've been thinking about even the end of democracy on our watch. We've said a lot of times, right? We don't know what's coming. We don't know what's going to come. I've sort of jokingly, on whatever form of social media I've been on, have referred to the many times, I guess normally it was Twitter, many times that I was just lying awake at night because I would wake up thinking about something that, will this happen, do I think, or will that happen, do I think? I don't know, but if this happens, but if that happens, I know many of you go through that same mind game of sorts, so it's not a game at all. At any rate, it's been tiring, it's exhausting, and in a variety of ways, it's for good reason. That's what I want to talk about today. What happened in the past? How do people confront these kinds of times in the past? We're going to talk about two different time periods. How can we think about the last year? And how should we prepare ourselves for going ahead? Now, obviously, I'm going to use my two base time periods, my two favorite time periods, because I've written books about them, to talk about this. Both of them, conveniently enough, thinking about contingency in different ways. The first one, most obviously of all, is the founding period. That's really my home base. That's where I've done most of my work and most of my writing. And the number one thing you have to think about when you think about the founding period is contingency. Because they were engaged in an experiment in government. That was the way that they described it. That's the word that they used to describe it. And if you're engaged in an experiment, by definition, it's contingent, right? By definition, no one knows the outcome. And that was the normal state of being in the American founding period, because they were creating a democratic republic in a world of monarchies. So they understood, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, things were contingent. Things could change dramatically. The entire experiment could collapse. It might do swimmingly well. Some weird thing might happen. Who knows? And I talked, I think, in the first episode of History Matters, and I know I've done it at least once since, and I'll mention it here, talked about a memo that Alexander Hamilton wrote to himself after the Constitutional Convention, like 10 days after, not meant for anyone other than himself. It's a private memo, and he's being very lawyerly, and he's thinking about what comes next. What does he think is going to happen next, as we are doing here this morning? And in a lawyerly way, he kind of sets out possibilities and options. And he first comes up with, the good idea about what might happen, the positive view. Maybe, Washington might be elected the first president, and that would be good. And then people trust him, so they would probably trust the people he puts in office, and that would be great. And that would enable people to have enough breathing space to be able to begin to trust this new government. And then he goes on in his lawyerly way, says, but if that doesn't happen, if Washington isn't president, or people don't trust the people he puts in office, if things go another way, then things might be bad, right? Then maybe foreign nations will sweep in and swallow up some of the states, or the states will form different confederations amongst themselves, or they'll turn on each other. And he describes this sort of apocalyptic, chaotic scenario about what could happen. And the kicker in the memo, which is why I constantly use it when I talk about contingency, is at the very end, he essentially says, I think that's most likely what's going to happen. That I want the Law and Order sound, doo doo, at the end of that comment, because 10 days after the federal convention, he's been working so long. He's like a foremost nationalist trying to push for a stronger national government. He has the Constitutional Convention. He has a new constitution in hand. He doesn't quite think it's strong enough, and he ultimately thinks probably going to collapse. That's contingency, folks. That's a primo example of contingency. And when you study the founding or look at the founding, it's hard to bear contingency in mind because it seems to us like a big series of courses. And of course, there's going to be a revolution. Of course, we won the revolution. Of course, we're going to declare independence and people would accept that. Of course, there's a constitution. Of course, the constitution was ratified. Of course, of course, of course, of course. And of course, there were no of courses in that time. People were figuring it out one step at a time. It was improv. And there are three quotes. See if I can find them here because I pulled them for this morning. Here we go. So there are three statements made in roughly 1789. One right after another. I've collected them here, and you'll hear why I've collected them. This is James Madison in 1789, right as the new government gets off the ground. He said in a letter, "We are in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." Talk about contingency. Then we have George Washington, also 1789, saying, "I walk on untrodden ground." Kind of a definition for contingency. And here is Senator William Maclay of Pennsylvania, who I adore, for his diary. Again, 1789. So these are all in the same year. Maclay says, quote, "The whole world is a shell and we tread on hollow ground every step." All three of them were referring to the new government starting in 1789. All three of them have remarkably similar metaphors, right? We're walking on hollow ground. The whole world is a shell. We are in a wilderness without a single step to guide us. Talk about people testifying to the power of contingency. That's what that is. That's the feeling that these people had as they launched the government, and they were aware of it. Now, I don't want to say that every American at the time walked around thinking contingency. So obviously the political elite who were putting things into motion were thinking about it. They also felt responsible for it, so that helped. There were many Americans living their lives and very aware that what was going on in the United States was distinctive, was special, was new. There were also many Americans who were just living their lives, right? And they understood in a general sort of a way what was going on, but it did not shape their existence in an enormous kind of way. So that's important to state. However, if the political leaders understand and acknowledge the contingency, the shapelessness, the fact that anything can really happen, that's important. And if at least a big chunk of Americans understand that too, that's important as well, because people recognize the kinds of times that they're in, and for better or worse, can at least be aware, consider what's happening, adapt themselves to changing times, be aware of possibilities, both good and bad. Some people in that kind of moment of extreme contingency, and even particularly political leaders, how did they respond to extreme contingency? They grabbed at power. And there's not one big founder blob, as I've said many times here, but it's not as though there's one virtuous founder blob or even just a huge cohort of virtuous founders. They were people, and some of them were more broad-minded than others, and some of them saw this climate and grabbed. Others thought more in the long term, but in one way or another, they certainly were aware that things were in flux and that they had to adapt, or that they could adapt their behavior accordingly. So in this early period, think of the fact that they have a recognition of the contingency of the times, of the instability of the times. It did some things that weren't wonderful, and I've talked about this in former episodes, right? It led sometimes to extreme emotion, to extreme polarization, to sort of knee-jerk reactions to things, the idea that one bad decision and the whole thing could come toppling down. It led sometimes to political violence. I think in the semi-recent past, I talked about the fact that John Adams, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson when they were both ex-presidents, referred to, at the time of his presidency, as that he experienced terrorism, the word he used, right? So they talk about some of the things that happen in times when things are really in flux. Not always good, but people were definitely aware, many people were definitely aware that that defined the time. Okay, so that's the founding period. I want to turn briefly now to the lead up, the decades leading up to the Civil War. Now, you know, as I said at the outset, the trick for me in writing my last book was, and it was an important trick, because what I was interested in was, why are members of Congress being violent towards each other? Not just were they, and how often were they, and how were they, but why? Why was that happening? And to understand that, and to understand what they were responding to and what they were hoping for, and the stresses of the moment in which they were acting, I couldn't say, well, you know, the Civil War is coming 3 years, 5 years. But so, yeah, if you had a Civil War coming, you would behave that way. No, I had to say, well, here I am in 1844, and I'm worried about how they discuss slavery in Congress, because I know slavery is really a huge national and problem that is unavoidable, and I'm not sure what's going to happen. And I have a vague sense that the Union might be threatened by this, but I mean, it's the Union, you know. I had to look ahead in time, and then I could try and figure out, how did the violence make sense in that, with that mental landscape? A lot of what I do in my work is trying to figure out how seemingly irrational things like violence are actually deliberate choices, and there's a logic behind them, and you can figure that out, or at least you can try to, if you're looking at the same landscape, or as much as you can get, as close as you can get to that landscape with the historical figures you're writing about. So looking ahead, they were there, people in the 1830s, 1840s, even 1850s. They don't know that a Civil War is down the pike. When you look through the diary of the fellow at the center of that book, The Field of Blood, Benjamin Brown French, who I basically lived with for about 15 years, his diary is wonderful as an indicator of changing sentiment, right? At different times he would think, oh, the whole thing's going down. Like when Congress would open and they couldn't elect a speaker, or they couldn't decide on rules, and it went on and on and on, and he thought the process was failing, you would see in his diary, like, sometimes I just think maybe we're seeing the death knell of the Union. And then things would start, and he would sort of back away a little bit, say, okay, here we go, we're going. And I don't like this, and I don't like that, and this is a little bit weird. And why does John Quincy Adams keep doing what he does? Because he's making the House really in an uproar. But you can see the fluctuations in his diary about, he's thinking about the Union all the time, but he doesn't really know what he's thinking about the Union at a given time, right? And he doesn't assume it's going to collapse at all. He's just worried, and at certain moments he thinks, oh. And he's certainly not alone in the way that he's evaluating what's going on. But the fact of the matter is, there were a lot of people that did not take that threat of disunion and civil war seriously, really seriously. And some of what I write about in my book, and that I've talked about before here, are, excuse me, people pleading with particularly members of Congress to please think before they act. The most striking example of that is in the 1850s, when member of Congress after member of Congress, congressman after congressman, stands up in one way or another and says to his fellows in the House or Senate, please watch your words. Please watch your words. Please, because you could say something here and it could provoke a huge reaction here and a huge reaction around the country, and it could, bad things can happen. So please watch your words. The fact that people again and again and again were standing up and pleading for that tells you, on the one hand, that people weren't necessarily watching their words, but also that these people understood that these were contingent times and people should be aware, they should be thinking about it, and some people weren't. There's a famous to me, Joanne Freeman, anonymous letter that I know I've talked about before. It's in my book, that someone wrote to the Speaker of the House. A Southerner in Congress wrote to the Speaker of the House, and essentially says in this letter, I'm writing to you. You are a Northerner and our Speaker. This is the late 1850s. I am a Southerner, but I am writing to you as a friend because I don't know. He's very excited by this story, because I don't know if I can hold back the Southerners in their reactions to things. The fact of the matter is, you don't know, Mr. Speaker, how angry and how edgy the Southerners are right now, and how much I'm trying with all my might to hold them back. I want you to do that for your friends, meaning Northerners generally, but also Northern Republicans. And he asks the Speaker and refers to dangerous words in the House as missiles. He says, please control the missiles from your side. I'll control the missiles from my side. Obviously, I remember that quote because that's so striking and so accurate, right? So there's a person who's like, I can read the room among my Southern friends here. And you probably aren't thinking about the state of affairs. You don't know about it, but I could tell you bad things could happen, very contingent times. Please be careful. It's really striking letter. And again, anonymous. I think it's signed a well-wisher. The whole thing. I love historical evidence like that just hits you over the head with the logic and emotion and again, the sort of mental landscape of a given moment. And that letter was a great example of that. So in the 1850s, you did have some people like the well-wisher who are saying, please be careful, please be careful. You do have Benjamin Brown French, who's like, I don't know. But what's striking is, with French, what you see right before the Civil War, I love the fact that Newby is offering you a vision of his butt. I apologize. It's the good millet. That French late in the 1850s in his diary suddenly is like, oh my gosh, I think we're going down. And he writes like just before the Civil War starts, he writes a letter. By that point, he's the chief Mason in the country, Freemason. And he writes to the various heads of Masonic lodges around the country. And he says in the letter, look, there's a lot of us and we're pledged to each other and we are bound to take care of each other and cooperate with each other. Maybe now is a moment when we can make a big difference. Maybe now is a moment when we can come forward, all of us, and try to persuade people to step back from the abyss. If all of you would do that, think how many people we could reach. And it's this pleading letter written while he's sitting at his wife's deathbed, and you couldn't create that better for the movies, but he's pleading with people. We're right there. We're at the edge. Maybe we can do something. Please, everyone step forward and tell everybody we're at the abyss and they need to step back. And of course, by that point, it's unclear whether anyone responds to that in a positive way. The one response I found was someone from what becomes West Virginia, a Mason, saying, why should I listen to you? You folks want to come in and destroy our homes and kill us. I'm not listening to you. And you could tell, he doesn't respond. French doesn't even respond. It's just like, okay, and that's where we are. I can't do anything. So there you have people, the lead up to the Civil War, who are, by that point, although it seems like a short amount of time, the Union has been around for decades. That makes a difference. It seems like it might be a thing, even though it still can be endangered. You have some people who are like, oh, it's okay. It's okay. Slavery is an enormous problem. We'll figure it out. There'll be a compromise, right? Let's make another compromise. No, let's make another compromise. People aren't assuming Newbie is really performing. You're getting head bobbing and everything. I'm sorry, I can't now. He's right. I can see him as I'm speaking, so it's hard for me to ignore him. At any rate, you have people on the lead up to the Civil War who are not thinking that they are on hollow ground, who are not thinking that, you know, every footstep is a dangerous footstep until very close to the end. So what is my point here? Well, let's look a little bit at last year, and then we'll look a little at the next year, and then I will stop for questions. So looking back to the last year, not going to go into it in detail since we all went through it together and talked about much of it. In many ways, this last year was a better year than we've had for a while, right? We lived in some of those for a good number of years, the sleepless years, the years when we truly didn't know, you know, am I going to wake up and there'll be a nuclear war? I don't know. And that's an interesting place to be. Or, I wonder what's going to happen now with this weird pandemic that nobody seems to be in control of. Interesting. Those were interesting times. I was talking with a friend about this yesterday. But recently, and I'm not going to talk about the pandemic because I have strong feelings about that, and it's not over, but I won't go into that. At any rate, still, this last year was less contingent feeling than others might have been. I think President Biden has been remarkably successful, whether you like everything he's done or not. He has done many good things. And he's, you know, they don't get played up really in the press. He's like this, not undercover, but like, he's just going along, doing the things, you know, and things are getting done. Again, as a historian, if I were a contemporary historian, I would want to come and look at press coverage and what he's doing and try and figure the whole thing out. But at any rate, he has been doing a lot of good. He has been doing things that have helped, not just him alone, but generally because of some things he's done and because of other things that have nothing to do with him. We are in a climate that feels less hyper contingent than it did. I read this morning when I was trying to think about what I was going to say that, in fact, violent crime is down in the last year. We would never know that because, as this article was explaining, there's a bad news. The media has a lean, a bias towards bad news, right? And so we always hear bad news, and they don't really talk about the good news. But the fact of the matter is, violent crime and murders are down in the country, and the article talks a little bit about it. I'm sure you can find it if you're interested. I think one of the things it says is with COVID, with places not being entirely locked down and social services and recreation centers and stuff opening, people have more places to go, people have more contact with communities and other people, and that's helped. But I think who knows if that's why or part of why. Newbie, you are just, he stops. I'm glad he's putting on a show for you. You're getting a sense of my life. This is my life with Newbie the History Bird. But at any rate, this is a feeling less like a sort of hyper contingent year. We had an election, the midterm election, where everyone was very aware of the fact that we didn't know what would happen. Not everybody believed that. And thus there were people constantly saying, democracy's going down, which I still think it's endangered in a very serious way. But the problem with that message, and one of the things that I think we're still dealing with, is that if you're constantly offering the message that democracy is in danger, it's going down, it's threatened, it might be gone, and then it doesn't go down, you have an election, actually, a really contingent election, where what everyone predicted would happen did not happen, right? People lost, a lot of the deniers lost, the secretaries of state who helped figure out elections on a state level. Many of the ones who were deniers did not get elected. Congress, there was not a red wave of any kind. There are all kinds of things that happened that no one expected. Contingency, right? And that was interesting and vital for us to remember, right? Because what that means is that you can make a difference. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but that message that this was an important election was an important message. Now, and I certainly was out with everybody else in the front yelling that message. I had many people respond to me again on social media saying, my Lord, we hear that all the time. As a matter of fact, I feel like we've been hearing it forever. As a matter of fact, we hear that every election. Like, well, yeah, no, we really don't. But the idea that that message is like heard so much that it no longer feels new, it's a problem. And Heather Cox Richardson and I have talked about this from time to time, that we try very hard to monitor the tone and pitch of the way we refer to what we consider to be the state of affairs, political affairs in the nation. Because if we come out too early in hyper mode, or if we are in hyper mode too much, if we gauge it wrong, then people aren't going to hear it anymore, right? A little bit of the boy who cries wolf problem. So, I think, what last year taught us, what the sort of ultimate lesson is, I'm running out of time, I'm 2 minutes over, but I have a few more things I want to say, is that change, we are in very contingent times, but that works for the better and for worse, right? And it partly means we can be in a bad way. Democracy can be just hollowed out, to get back to that metaphor from the beginning of my comments today, that things could happen in a remarkably short period of time that we might not even be able to fathom, right? That we have to be aware of that. But what that also means is that in a time of great fluctuation and instability, it means that you can make a difference. You could step forward. What you do matters, because it's a time for better or worse of possible change. That's what contingency is, right? That there, who knows what's going to happen? Things might change dramatically. Well, what that means is they can change for the better or for the worse. And that's vitally important to remember. That's more like what the founder folk were doing, right? Well, these are really contingent times. And sometimes that led them to violence and hyperpolarization. Sometimes that just led them to think really carefully about what they were doing, which might have led to good choices or bad choices, but they were aware of the fact that they were in particularly contingent times in the United States as a new government was launched. The pre-Civil War folk kind of were, although they were worried about the Union in a way we no longer really do, they still were kind of assuming that, fluctuations, but it's not all going to go down until a very late point when they suddenly thought, wait, what does this mean? And I write in my book about a moment when, on one particular day, when a lot of Southerners, several states seceded from the Union, and the Southern representatives stood up and left, I believe it was the House chamber, leaving empty seats. And one of the members of Congress in the room looked around and then said, in a sort of slightly, puzzled way, "The Union is dissolved." He just watched it happen, right? That's big contingency. So at any rate, better to be aware of the moment that you're in and to think about what it means and what you can do for the better. Not so good to just dismiss what you're seeing as, it's always like this, more of the same, things will be fine. And I'm not saying if you do the latter, then you're going to have a civil war. And if you do the former, you're going to have a government that functions. I'm really not saying that. And as a historian, I would never say if it happened before, it will happen again. History doesn't repeat, but it can definitely teach. And particularly in a time of extreme contingency, it can teach a lot. It has a lot to say. So looking ahead to next year, I would encourage you to be aware always of what's going on and what it suggests. As I've said many times before, to think about why people are doing what they're doing. If you have a strong response to something, think about why you're having that response. Are you having it because someone wants you to have a strong response? Are you responding to partisan strategic behavior or not? Consider your reactions, consider the words that people are using, consider the implications of what's going on around you, consider what you can tell about the intents or objectives of people around you. Be aware of the time that we're in. It's part of what History Matters is all about, is using history to keep us aware and thoughtful as a community, which is part of how we can be most aware and thoughtful. That's how I want us to head into the new year. That's how I want us to frame how we think about what's to come. We can make a difference, but we have to stay aware. We can acknowledge that things are better than they've been without saying they're just fine and I can now put my feet up. That's, I think, where we are. Stay aware, be aware of what might happen, but watch and wait and see, right? Personally, I'm prepared for bad things to happen. I don't necessarily expect them to happen, but I'm very prepared. And that is how I live my life, right? Is watching, thinking about what's happening, thinking about the implications. Sometimes I veer towards bad, sometimes I veer towards good, but I'm very aware and very thoughtful about everything that I see around me. And I encourage you, particularly with all of the episodes of History Matters behind you, to do the same. There's one last thing I want to mention, only because it shows what I'm saying so well, and I skipped over it and it just made me laugh. It's a cartoon. I'm going way over, but hey, what the heck? It's a cartoon that I saw, and I think I put it, I reposted it on post, and it's titled Climate Change, a Timeline. And so first there's a big chunk of like red, and it says above it, climate change isn't real. Then there's a slightly smaller line, which is yellow, and it says, okay, climate change is real. We're just not convinced it's caused by humans. Then there's like a relatively small little area, green, and it says, oops. And then there's a tiny little bit of purple at the end. I'm not going to use the word that it says. Let's just say it says, oh crap. So that's what I'm talking about, right? Oh, it's not real. Maybe it's real, but who cares? Oops. We don't want to be in that last category. We want to be thinking ahead. Okay, I am going to stop there. Even before the mug. Thank you. Now I see the mugs. This in a way will be very logical. This mug, because it kind of is the theme of what I've just been talking about. History should make you uncomfortable. Don't take things for granted. Always be aware in a positive way, but in a wary way. Okay, I'm going to stop talking because, and is Tom the one who gave this to me? Because I forget all the time. I'll move my hands.
You have a spreadsheet for mugs if you're new to the chat.
I know, that's right. So if you are new, there is a mug spreadsheet because people have been very kind, and since every week I have a mug that is thematically related to what we talk about. I have not had the number of mugs that we've had weeks, but people sent mugs, and I continually forget who they're from. And now there's a spreadsheet. So okay, I'm going to stop so that we can talk about questions.
We have so many questions.
Okay.
But they're all great. I'm so excited. Okay, so the first question comes from our friend Mary Beth, who's been very active in the chat. It says, given the hoopla this week about George Santos and his many fabrications, has there been anything of this sort in history? Is there an example of someone who outright lied, not just fudged, to get into office?
So I'm going to have a historian answer. Have there been people in the past who just lied and got into office? Sure. Has there been an example where someone entirely created a life, and then on top of that, and I say this a lot, part of what's distinctive about this moment isn't just things like that. Like, hi, I'm going to make up a whole persona and an entire life for myself, none of which is real, and then I'm going to get elected on it. Part of what's noteworthy about this moment is the lack of response on the part of his allies. That's the thing, right? I've said many times before, part of what's distinctive about this moment isn't necessarily the corruption or bad behavior or cheating or whatever. Part of what's striking and alarming is particularly people on the right, when someone does something like creates a life for themselves or seemingly tries to get a coup going. People, I can't even imagine, I'm going to say the sentence, when someone tries to get a coup going, boy, Republicans haven't stepped up and denounced it. Think about that sentence, right? That people, many people in power on the right side of the aisle don't speak up when these things happen. If they did, it would make a difference. The fact that they're not is striking. It was one of the earliest things way back that struck me, and I know a lot of other historians. We were like, yeah, okay, well, this is happening, interesting. Why isn't anyone speaking up? Why aren't people on the right saying we don't accept this? So that's part of what we see now. It's not simply this guy made up a life for himself in such a dramatic way. to such an extreme degree that I don't know if I could say that that's been exactly duplicated in the past, but the hyper noteworthy thing about that is just the way in which it happened. I'm sure some people on the right knew about it because they were supporting him. And even if they didn't, it happened, it was revealed. And I think only a handful of Republicans have said, boy, that's not acceptable. That's quite something, to do. The other thing that I'll note about that, which isn't really in the question, but I've been thinking about it, is that given the degree to which in our times, there's so much lying and people get away with it because there's no accountability, which I've talked about all the time, and also and almost maybe second runner up to contingency is accountability. People aren't being held accountable. People are lying all the time. There's news and lies swirling around in social media in various ways. It's also entirely conceivable that he just thought, oh, no one will know. I'm lying. Other people lie. They do okay, even if they know. So what? Big deal. I have support. I can deny it. Right? So in the climate that we're in, it's entirely conceivable that Santos thought, well, these are our times, right? And that I won't be necessarily held responsible for this. I have no idea. I don't know anything about him other than the fact that I know nothing about him. But at any rate, very much worth thinking about, not just the fact that it happened and that no one commented, but also what does it suggest that it could happen? Okay.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night as a teacher, because kids are seeing this example and they're seeing it normalized. And then they're like, why am I getting in trouble for lying at school? Like,
right.
Leaders are doing it.
Right.
Okay, so this one comes from our friend and longtime participant, Miranda Bailey Peets. She's asking you to comment if you have any thoughts on Greta Thunberg's tweet to Andrew Tate that led to his arrest for human trafficking.
Well, okay, so this is interesting. I actually read about this wording, and I stumbled across it. I wasn't preparing with it, but I want to say that it was on Post. Someone, a news-focused individual, had sent that out, saying, "Look at that!" That she attacked him, and he responded, and there was the pizza box that showed he was in Romania. And what this person did is track the news reports in Romania, and like he went all the way back. And what he discovered is that's not what happened. That the Romanian police say they were using all kinds of things to try and figure out where he was, and that they were using social media to track him. Mm-hmm. And then they figured out he was in Romania. Says nothing about the pizza box. Says not. I mean, that whole thing, which makes perfect sense. And they did use the phrase in what they were saying, social media, is that there's actually no evidence that that's precisely what happened, which is kind of a bummer because that was quite an interesting story.
That would have been a good movie.
It would have been a wonderful movie, and well, I won't even go to him, but at any rate, given the sorts of things he says, her response, I was like, and then the pizza box, right? I was like, that's so satisfying. So I hate to do this if I'm spoiling your sense of what happened, but apparently that's not what happened.
Which is why it's important to check your sources.
Indeed.
Okay, our good friend Jen asks, I've heard that Madison and Hamilton wrote a constitutional amendment to fix the monkey wrench Jefferson threw in the Electoral College system. Do we have the text of the proposed amendment? And if so, what are the chances of that getting passed today, given originalists would have a hard time arguing against something that Madison wrote himself?
Well, okay, so I'm going to offer a slightly off-target version of this, which is important only because it's a reminder of what people thought the Electoral College was for, right? Hamilton, in his original plan of government that he came in and that hit during his 6-hour speech that he discussed, he wanted not just electors, he wanted electors of electors, right? The point of electors was to keep the public away from the election. The public can choose electors, and then they need to shut up and get out of the way. And then the electors, these men who have some knowledge, they can choose the electors. Hamilton even wanted another layer to separate the people from what was going on. So the fact of the matter is, it's not as though the founders like created the electoral college and they were like, oops, wow, that's really complicating matters. In a sense, what they were saying is, we really better throw some barriers up here because we don't trust the people, the American people, to pick a president. It should be relatively elite men like us who do this kind of work. That's important to remember because we now, for hopefully and for good reasons, assume that the desired outcome is democracy, but that was not necessarily the desired outcome of what people were doing when they were crafting the Constitution, and the Electoral College is a great example of that.
All right. Okay, we've got Dave, our good friend Dave, frequent Q&A contributor. He says a little bit off topic, but he's wondering what 1 or 2 or 3 books that he's asking all 3 of us. Oh, John, wake up. What would we recommend from the past year? Also wondering what those in the chat would recommend. Maybe we could save this one for the after party so people can think about it, and you can think about it and John can think about it. But
it's a great question.
Top 3 books. I know that's a great end of the year question.
Exactly.
We're going to table that for the after party. And if you're
let me explain for a moment that we will have an after party for those. If there's anyone here who's new, and when we're done with the questions, we stop recording and then we have the after party. So if you want to be part of that conversation, then please stick around, but I'll get to that at the end. Okay.
And you can, those of you in the chat can start adding your top 3 books anytime you want. Okay, this comes from our good friend Dale Van Eck, and I think Dale comes to us from Williamsburg, which is where I spent the holidays. And Dale, I
nice.
got together for coffee. What was I thinking? Met a bunch of the nieces. Which member of the founding generation who understood the contingency of the new government did the most to ensure its success? Good question.
Wow. Well, this is going to be an easy answer in a sense, but I actually think it's a good answer. And I hate to do this. I hate to point to like one elite guy and be like, oh, yes. I do this when I teach the American Revolution, and I have a lecture that's like the importance of George Washington. And I say to students, it's not like one person makes a huge difference, except he actually did. And I'm going to give him the credit for, in the early government. I'm going to give him that credit, mostly because he was, number one, the only person everyone trusted. So what he did really mattered. He was the figure who controversy centered around because the default was monarchy. So here's the guy, he's in the office that many assumed is going to just collapse into monarchy anyway. So he is in this, totally undefined, hyper public, extremely important precedent-setting office. And he was, he talked about contingency like every day, which is an exaggeration. But when you look through his correspondence from this time period, it's like one long stream of holy smoke. Like, I think I should do this. What do you 5 people think I should do? What if I do this? It's him constantly trying to figure out the repercussions of his actions. I think if he had not behaved that way, then it might not have survived. And I think because of the position he served in, he had to be, by definition, aware of the contingency of the situation.
Good one. All right. This comes from our friend Jennifer. She says, I use Washington's farewell letter in my class every year. We address the 3 major warnings he leaves us with: parties, foreign powers, and sectionalism. Could I also explain contingency with that letter? She's asking.
Yes. Think about the fact that it's not as though it was expected that he would give a farewell address. It's not even as though it was expected he would step down. And he steps down and basically says, whatever you do, be careful about these things. He's not saying them in an abstract way. He's saying them in a very specific way, right? These 3 things could bring us down. This, please be. You said I'm a history bird. You are a history bird, Newbie. At any rate, he was sending that out as a kind of warning, right? So the spirit in which he gave that message, he wasn't like screaming from the rooftops, but he meant it not just as see ya, but as I step out of the picture, please be aware of these things because they're important. They could bring us down, and I'm leaving the stage. So whatever happens next, I hope you guys will think about these things.
All right. Jen, you are very welcome. We love that question. Okay, our good friend Dave asked, it seems that who will be the next Speaker of the House is an obvious contingency today. Was this sort of uncertainty regarding who'd be the Speaker true in the past? Historically, is who the Speaker is important politically? And how have speakers influenced history? That's a big question.
That's a big question and an excellent one. I'll answer it not at great length since I want to be sure everyone gets a chance. However, it's an important question because number one, yes, it's highly contingent always because it's really important. The speaker can have an impact on, who is allowed to speak or not speak. The speaker helps appoint committees, so it can have a huge impact on who's in committees and who chairs committees. In the days that I write about, the speaker helped to assign printing contracts, and some newspapers only stayed in power because they had government printing contracts. The speaker has a huge ability to shape the direction of what's going on in the House. So it's been seen as a really key thing for a very, very long time. And sometimes it has been very fraught. That one of the things that sends Benjamin Brown French into a tizzy has been trying to decide who's the speaker, because the longer that kind of decision is drawn out and seems unable to be decided, the more he's like, well, this is it. If we can't name a speaker, then what's going to happen next? It's think about the letter I cited a few moments ago from the well-wisher saying, please be careful. That's someone writing to a speaker, and in that case, a Northern anti-slavery speaker in the late 1850s. That was a huge, big deal. When you read the accounts of Republicans at the time, Northern anti-slavery party, and they get the speakership a couple of years before the Civil War, the eruption, the jubilation that a relatively new party, and they got that key seat, was huge. That was huge for any number of reasons. So yeah, it is highly contingent. Yeah, it can have a great impact on what does or doesn't happen, who is or isn't important. And that's one of those things that I would say, be really aware of what's coming, and depending on what happens, think and act accordingly.
All right. I just added something for John that he needs to look at really quickly in the chat for me while we move on to the next question. This is from our friend Gloria, longtime participant. Gloria asks, during the Civil War period, they increasingly did not tolerate a legitimate opposition. The anger prevented that. Many people felt the death knell of democracy is the lack of respect for the opposition. Are we now in a similar situation which would lead to the death of democracy? And she says, particularly on the left, the opposition, respect for, I think she's saying lack of respect for the opposition, in parentheses, she has particularly on the left. And she is wondering, do you think we're now in a similar situation where people can't consider the opposite side and it's the death of democracy?
Well, I mean, we're at a point where people aren't really necessarily listening to each other, but I think if you go back to the Civil War period, the period at which people weren't listening to each other. They weren't listening to each other at all in the handful of years leading up to the Civil War. But the people who didn't put up with an opposition were the people who seceded, right? They just were like, we're out. And it wasn't as though the conversation was done. They drew out, they left. They said, we're gone. That's like the Federalists who felt, we're not heard, we're just not going to stick around for this anymore, we're leaving. And then once you have people who are seceded, then there isn't an opposition party per se, because it's just the people who are either support the government or are against the government. I think there's not a lot of effective communication on all sides now, but I think some people on the right have a sense of free speech that excludes accountability, and that does not help communication at all. And I think that extremists on the right who are openly willing to use violence in response to the opposition, and I don't want to get into the whole like, but Black Lives Matter. I'm talking about people who are armed and standing in front of ballot boxes. That there are some people who are very explicitly saying like, no opposition, right? If you're going to be opposition, I'm going to threaten you with a gun. So I think there's on all sides, people aren't talking to each other, but this isn't quite a both sides situation to me. I think to be as even-handed as I can be, that yes, there are some extreme people on the left who aren't willing to hear certain things. Totally true. But I think it's right now, it's people on the right who are declaring the opposition out of bounds, not American, not human. You know, that's a propaganda technique. And that's largely coming or has been coming from certain parties on the right.
All right, good questions. Okay, this comes from our dear friend Cece, who's with us almost every Friday. She says, is there maybe in the GOP or generally a kind of ignorance of the contingency thing in Congress these days? She's asking, are representatives in both houses depending too much on the view of a kind of permanence of the founding documents that the founders never had or intended?
Interesting. Think about that one for a sec. Guys, you're asking such good questions.
Cece always asks those really like,
Yes.
that's why we love her.
I know. I don't think there's a uniform answer for that. Are there some people who are really just not acting responsibly right now because they're taking things for granted? Yes. Are there some people who realize that there is an abyss at some point looming out there and that it needs to be acknowledged? Yes. So I think there are some people who are acting in a hyper extreme manner, as though that's a responsible thing to do right now. Not that I'm saying no one should be extreme, but you need to be thinking hard about what you're doing, whether it's extreme or not. And there are some people who are behaving as though they're oblivious to risk, who I think they could say what they want to say and do what they want to do while still acknowledging risk. I know that's a very sort of roundabout answer because I don't want to, I try very hard here to generally not take a side, although obviously I tend to lean left, but still.
All right.
I want to say too, only I gather that what happened is there was a bad person in chat, and I only saw that because I saw he's been removed. It's obviously it's not your fault, it's not my fault. I just want to apologize for it because it's the precise opposite of what should be going on in our community here, and the precise opposite of what normally does. So
it rarely happens. I think it's only the second time in 2.5 years. So
exactly,
those of you who were helping us monitor that, that's why Joanne, I felt I was trying to like handle that quietly under the table and
oh no, I as soon as I saw he's been removed, I was like, oh, that explains everything.
why Annie looks so crazy. Yeah, you guys are great helping us keep this a friendly and a really helpful environment for.
I'm sorry for that. I mean, in a way, maybe, okay, we were reminded about the fact that that's out there too.
Yep, exactly. All right. We've still got more questions. We've got 2 more. I think we can handle it. We'll go a teeny bit over. Our good friend, Tim, who always helps us out with links in particular. Tim is asking, one critique raised with the final January 6th report is the absence of any extended discussion on the role of Christian nationalism or more broadly, religious extremism. Is there any historical presence of religious extremism in your favorite period of history, i.e. the founding era that runs up to the Civil War?
Wow, you guys, the questions. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes when my students ask about, so this is the founding period we're generally talking about, when they want to look at religion and how it's being used in politics in another period, I'll send them to the election of 1800. And they're always surprised because the Federalists, who are hyper worried, democracy, French Revolution, the opposition, they're bringing us down. And they are deploying religion in a variety of different ways, the Christian religion in a variety of different ways to get people on alert. Like Christianity is being threatened. Thomas Jefferson is a fanatical atheist. We're all going down. And the degree to which Christianity gets deliberately yoked into that election by Federalists, conservative, New England, what's the Jeffersonian phrase for it? I'm not gonna get it. His phrase, the reign of witches, is part of what refers to it. Witches, he's talking about the Salem trial. There are these people who are hyper-centered on religion and a right way and a wrong way, and use it really bluntly and not very usefully in that election. So if you want to see people using religion in kind of an extreme way, there's even, you guys are masters at this. I'm sure you could Google it if you have JSTOR that has, history journals in it. If you look up that election and you look up election of 1800, atheist Jefferson, you will get a lot of stuff. There's a famous advertisement that's like, vote for Adams and the Constitution or vote for Jefferson and no God. It's like, okay, there it is.
All right, we have one last question for 2022, and
Wow.
it goes to Dale. Dale gets to wrap it up for the year. He says, not including the time that after shots were actually fired, but who did have a serious sense of the coming Civil War and stated it publicly?
Before shots were fired. Good question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to put my finger on one person, because what's fascinating about that period is people trying to figure it out. And, the abolitionists were aware of the risk of what they were doing, but also felt for good reason that they needed to speak up against slavery during a time of contingency. And they certainly wouldn't have been the ones to step forward and say, what we're doing right now? Well, what we're doing right now might push us towards civil war. So, I would assume that part of the answer to that question would be a moderate Northerner, who they might have called a doughface, who was just trying to make everything smooth and would have been worried about where things were headed. But right now I am sitting here not able to put my finger on the right person, but I can certainly say that, yes, there would have been some people serving that role, stepping up and saying, this actually might really happen. This might really happen. Like I said, Benjamin Brown French ultimately gets to a point where he's like, ah! So there were certainly people constantly ringing that refrain. It just wasn't the majority of people.
We did it. We had 11 questions today. We usually average 7 to 9. We did 11.
You guys, man, those were excellent.
They were
questions. So, and thank you for sticking with us through the bad moment. Okay, so I want to conclude with a few things. I know exactly, Carolee, thank you. First off, I want to say that if there's anyone here who's new, here's what happens next, and then immediate context. What we will do next is head to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording this conversation, because this will get posted in the archive of all of the last Carolee. Oh, there you go. Look at that. 143rd episode. So all of these 143 episodes are all posted and archived. We go to the after party. We're not recording. What that means is that we can be freer and easier in our conversation and talk about whatever we choose to talk about. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, stay right where you are, and poof, it's normally on the bingo card. You will be in the after party. And if you are watching us on Facebook, to get to the after party, you need to leave Facebook and you need to join us through ncheteach.org/conversations. go to that, find us, click on it, and you too, poof, will be in the after party. As the year is closing here, and before we move to the after party, I want to say part of what I always say and a little bit more. So I do always say, and if I thought about this other mug and then I didn't choose it, right? The mug that says, thank you for engaging in the conversation of democracy. I don't even remember my precise words, but there is a mug that basically thanks you for doing this every week, for engaging in the conversation of democracy, for considering important things, for asking questions, for talking about tough topics, for being open-minded and willing to address things as a community, except for the schnook who got booted off today. Isn't that a good word, schnook? As ever, I want to thank you for being here, partly because I think it's important for us. Certainly a number of you have said that this got you through some difficult times, got me through some difficult times, but I also think it's important for the big we, because the fact that we can do this, and we have done this for 2 years, more, and we don't all agree, and we are able to converse with each other and really prod and poke topics and not just toss off niceties and superficial answers. That's the sort of thing that gives a person hope for democracy and the democratic process and community, and the fact that although we're lacking in some ways as a people now a sense of a we, which I used to talk about a lot, that kind of got cycled out somewhat. It's in the center of my thoughts a lot. We are in a bit of a crisis of we, but we are here every week. And the fact that this happens and has happened for so long with such enthusiasm and such passion on the part of all of us, that matters tremendously. So as the year ends, first of all, I want to thank you for being here for yet another year. And that goes for John and Annie, who you guys have my heart for being here and doing what you do. I don't even know what to say. I just want to say thank you because it means so much. But I also just want to, looking ahead, what I wish for all of us is a good year, a thoughtful year, a year of positive change, a year when we remember to take care of ourselves, to not get caught up in the contingency at every moment of every day. And maybe more than anything else, a year in which we all celebrate and engage with and value our we, whatever that we means, whether it's your family, whether it's your friends, whether it's your local community, whether it's us here at History Matters. I even got the name of our webcast wrong. At any rate, I hope that next year will be a year of we, however you want to define that. We all deserve a caring, supportive we. And that's what I wish for us going into the new year.
Now you're making me cry.
Oh,
Shirley knows I'm a big crybaby. I cry at Disney movies, I cry at Hallmark commercials, I cry very easily.
I normally, there are certain occasions in which I cry and then I feel like goofy. At any rate, okay, yes, huzzah! Thank you, Mary Beth. Okay,
so we've had so many people adding their book suggestions in. I went ahead and added mine.
Okay,
because I didn't want to
group
forget.
hug, yes.
Yes, group hug, absolutely, yes. And I don't know if you guys have seen this. I'm sure you have. Around New Year's, the last few years, people have been doing like a one-word hashtag where people think of one word that they're going to carry into the new year. Mine was grace. After what you were just saying, that came to mind. But I think your hashtag we could be your one word, Joanne.
We.
Yeah. So yes, people keep adding your book list, because now my Amazon cart is getting full of more books. Like I need more books. My niece is here. One of the nieces is already here for the sleepover, and she's been helping me kind of clean through some of my sister's things that, you know, it's been a little over a year since we lost our sister, and I was trying to purge things. You know how it is. You just don't want to part with things. But now I feel like I need to, like, I can't keep everything, right? So we've been going through things every time she comes to visit. So I have too many books apparently. So I can either give some books away or I can buy another bookshelf. So
let's segue to the after party and we can.
Yeah.
Our
John, you can turn off your Facebook, I think.